Today, on this episode of Going Deeper, we are going to be talking about active faith in the Old Testament and how that plays out into our lives still today. We're also going to be talking about the land distribution for the 12 tribes of Israel and some interesting threads that start to show up and how they begin to complete the story and tie the story, bringing Abraham's covenant with God through into the fruition of, or God's hopeful fruition of, the Israelites taking the land. I am your host, Kyle McCaskill.
I'm Marie Burns.
I'm Becky Clark.
And we will get into this in just a second.
So this week, gosh, y'all are, man, we're sharing this week. We're teaching together. We are team teaching.
We are team teaching.
There will be songs, dances, liturgical dancing. No, there will be none of those things.
Kind of afraid of liturgical dancing.
True. Well, so these chapters can be kind of dry.
That's why Becky has her water bottle.
No. Stop it.
The small water bottle.
These chapters can be a little dry to just the casual reader, and so we thought in the beginning when we were going through the book, it's not fair for one of us to have to take such dry chapters and try to make them interesting. We got to do this together. We're in it together. But now I will say, and just like with Leviticus, I have a new appreciation for what was once viewed and still honestly kind of is dry. I have a new appreciation for it.
Well, you can get bogged down. You can get very bogged down in the boundaries and the cities and the things and the stuff that you've never heard of and really can't even find on a map of the Holy Land.
So how many chapters is this?
So we're covering chapter 13 through 19, which is...
It sounds like a lot, but really...
Yeah, it really does. And when y'all said 13 through 19, I got to admit I was a little skeptical that it could be done.
Yeah.
And then I started reading through some of the material, and I thought, well, this is why we're covering 13 through 19.
I guess we could have split it down and done east of the Jordan and then west of the Jordan, but...
Well, we debated about it and wondered if it would take us 2 weeks to do this. But we're going to have to be more succinct in our teaching tomorrow, which really is the plus of doing the podcast, because we can dig a little bit more into some of the things we probably won't cover as much tomorrow in the video teaching. But there's a lot of repetition.
Yeah.
And then it moves fast too. And you could spend a lot of time on each one. The way you could do it is talking about kind of the history of those particular areas that each tribe gets, as well as what a lot of those areas become. That would probably be quite interesting.
Yeah.
But for our purposes, it doesn't necessarily fit what we're doing. We're really trying to stay in this particular time period of the taking of the land and the fulfillment of promise. But you could spend more time talking about how that promise blooms out in those tribes and areas, kind of on a later date. So you could make it stretch longer.
Yeah.
If you really wanted to.
Yeah. If you wanted to.
There are some very interesting stories in all of this.
And that's kind of the way we'll go with it.
Yeah. But you're dividing up land, and I think getting the overarching theme of what is coming, and I guess you're seeing really for the very first time, like really the first time, what God promised back in Genesis to Abraham actually start to take shape with boundaries and real delineation of tribes and all that. And I know, Becky, you said that you had some of that you were going to take us through, and I'm maybe jumping ahead.
Well, no, not necessarily. You mentioned the Genesis, so it really starts in I mean, there's probably smatterings of it before Genesis 12, but Genesis 12 is really where the promise happens. It says in Genesis 12, kind of verse 5c, because verse 5 is really long. So towards the end of it, when so Abraham and all of his family had come to the land of Canaan, Abraham passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land, and we know through our reading the Canaanites are still in the land at this point of Joshua.
Yep.
Well, until they've cleared them out, mostly. Then the Lord appeared to Abraham and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." And after that, they kind of travel down a little more, and Abram creates another altar, and they kind of look out on the space a little bit more. So that's where this initial promise of this area begins. And now here we are in Joshua, that is being fulfilled. It's no longer Abram that's looking out at this land. Now it is the thousands of Israelites that have come from Abram who are actually now taking the land as their own. They're not living as nomads anymore. They're not living as visitors in the land, which is what Jacob did. Now they are the inhabitors of, and they can claim it as their own because it is first their God's.
Right.
So as, what's the word that we use when we talk about tithe? We are the
stewards.
We are the stewards. They become the stewards of the land of God instead of just the sojourners through the land.
Which you make is a very short jump to look back at the Garden of Eden, that connection of what Adam and Eve were to the garden as stewards of that land. And now here we are in the promised land and stewards. And oh boy, there's a whole other connection. A whole other rabbit hole we could dive down with that.
Yeah. I want to bring one other Genesis passage, and this one is between the Lord and Jacob. So in Genesis chapter 35, 9 through 12, this is what it said. When God appeared to Jacob again, when he'd come from Paddan Aram, and he blessed him. And God said to him, "Your name is Jacob." And this is where they changed his name. "No longer shall you be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name." So he was called Israel. And God said to him, "I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply," which he does.
Yep.
"A nation and a company of nations shall come from you. The land that I gave to Abraham and Isaac, I will give to you, and I will give the land to your offspring after you." So now here we are again. Jacob's sons are represented in these 12 tribes that are going to be named in this section that we're talking about. And it will be called, they are the people of Israel. They are the Israelites. Jacob's name changed. There's more fulfillment of that right now. They have been fruitful and multiplied. They will be fruitful and multiply some more and take more of the land. But here we are, another part of the promise that we can see is being fulfilled. So to me, as dry as boundaries are, and there's just no way to get around, like, they're really dry.
Yeah.
And kind of boring, and just, you can bog down. If you pull yourself up, the excitement of the people of God as the land is being divided, and your boundaries for your tribe is being laid out, that now it's yours.
Right.
You know, now the thing that your ancestors have told you about, that you hoped for in the desert when you watched your older people die so that you could get to this point, and what you fought for all these years. Now. Finally.
Yeah.
Right? So then you start to get the excitement, the eagerness, the joy that comes with how these people must have felt.
Right.
And now it's not as dry.
Right.
You know?
One of the commentators I read on this section was talking about how, of course, after all of this waiting and the promise and the waiting and all that they've been through, of course, you're going to walk every aspect of this boundary and list every river and every town. Of course, you're going to be painfully detailed to the modern day reader, but because of how special this is to them, of course, you're going to talk about all the specifics. And you don't get very far before you notice how specific Judah is. By the time we get to the rest of them, it does go quite fast, but you still know their boundaries. I mean, most of the maps you look at are very similar. Not many people draw different lines. Every once in a while you might get a slight difference, but for the most part everyone agrees about where these lands are and were.
Yeah, and the only disagreements really come from a lot of the places that are listed within the scriptures are places that I guess to some point after that kind of got lost. So sometimes the boundaries are just a little bit hazy.
Yeah.
And that's why people kind of question a little bit where exactly, or was this really a place you just got to kind of take. Plus, lands got named different things too.
Right.
And some places had kind of the same name in the north and maybe really similar to something in the south. So it can get confusing. That's what I told you. I was drawing on a map. I was trying to read the scripture and draw out the boundary lines, part because I thought it was interesting and part because I didn't want my eyes to glaze over.
Right.
But it was really difficult because I was missing some cities and I had kind of a really old map. At the same time, so I was cheating with a picture on my computer of one that was already drawn if I got super confused. But there are some places that are just not.
Oh yeah.
They're not known anymore or anything. Some stuff gets kind of lost. But yeah, for the most part, they're similar.
Right.
So.
And I mean, the reality is, yes, things like reading, land grant documents from the clerk of court, in today's day and age, not your average everyday Joe is going to say, oh, wow, this is fascinating.
Right.
Until, let's make this connection to why this is important for them and it's important to us. But, how popular is Ancestry.com right now?
Oh, yeah.
And people going, and now all those documents that are just really dry and really boring, it just says that, so-and-so was, their plot of land was this here, and it's got these geographical coordinates on it and everything. But now you're vested in it.
Right. Good point.
And so you're saying, oh, this is actually interesting. And I think if we make that hop to, these are my people too. The Israelites, they're my people too. And I think I was saying earlier that when you start looking at the names, pay attention to the names, and then maybe a tool that you can do is you can start writing these names down and track them backwards to trace this genealogy, and it starts, the picture starts coming into more focus. And then you start to see why these names that are hard to pronounce, why it matters,
Sure.
that this person got this, that person got that. And we begin to see that the book of Joshua in this section of it is not just this thing that exists in isolation in this really boring part. It helps complete the story. There's a reason why it's here, and it's here to help complete the story if we're willing to look for it.
One other element of commentator that I read, we really haven't touched on necessarily who the author of Joshua is. There's some
true.
We call it Joshua. We say it's Joshua. It's not. He can't write his own death scene, kind of thing. So
Moses did.
But we just think of it that way. And Doug has continuously asked us, well, who's the author? Well, one commentator made a very interesting statement in regard to this section of the book, that it was likely that it was the author was someone who was living in the exile period. So they're not living in the promised land anymore. They've been carted off, probably during the Babylonian time, in no sense, because the Assyrians decimated the northern kingdom. So then again, if you think about it, of the author's intent to write these boundaries, it's because they lost them. And he's going back to the promise that God gave. We actually were given the land. Here are our boundaries. Here is we had the opportunity to live into it. We lost it, but we believe and we trust that God is going to get us back to that place, and these boundaries will be redrawn. The promise will be renewed. It has never been lost to us. Like God has never given up on it. We have given up on it, but the excitement is that this is still our land. Because God fulfilled that promise from this stretch of time when he first promised Abram to when we get to Joshua, and now we're beyond the conquered time, living in exile. That's still our land that God has promised for us. So when you look at it in that regard too, it's very powerful and different way to read this. The author is saying, not just for the excitement of the people who took it at the time, but for us who are waiting to go back to it.
Wow. Yeah, that
It's a new spin on it.
it does.
So much of this book isn't even about the battle, it's about the land
Yeah.
itself. I mean, it's got the name Joshua, and it's often talked about as the book of holy war, but really that is just a small piece. So much more of this deals with the land itself and the land itself and the allotments within that.
And even in that, one of the things that Marie and I had kind of talked about, especially as we've been preparing for this week, is in the midst of all the kind of dry of the allotments are actually some really great nuggets of story of people. And so again, it goes back to, it's not necessarily the battles that are happening. Those aren't really the most significant portions,
Right.
you know, in this war book. It's not really a war book, you know.
No.
I mean, those things happen, and we're having to wrestle with what God is doing in the midst of those things and asking his people to do, and what happened to the Canaanites. And that's just a hard struggle. But at the same time, even in the taking of the land, it's about the people
Yeah.
and their relationship with God, not as much of just land boundaries or just a battle. Those really do become quite secondary as you read this book in this full thread. And Joshua has taken on a whole new kind of view for me as I've spent time in it. And
Oh, yeah.
some of those struggles and questions are still there, but it is not the book that I had initially kind of thought it
Yeah.
was as we've spent more time in it. It's a lot more fascinating.
Oh, yeah.
And we thought it was going to be, we're talking about all these wars and the Holy War and the
Yeah.
whatever, but there's just such good stuff in it.
Such good stuff.
And another commentator I read said this is one of the places where people, you know, if you're doing like a read through the Bible,
Yeah.
this is a lot of places where people get stuck and they just
Yeah.
kind of quit because of all the battle and the land. And, I mean, it can be so.
Yeah.
But if you read it with the intent of something else, to kind of really see God in the midst of it,
Yes.
then those things really, you don't get caught up in that and get bored,
Yeah.
you know, or close your Bible because of it, or whatever.
And that's the point where, you know, periodically we touch on reading the Bible and how to get through Bibles and commentaries when you are a lay person. And that's when you're getting bogged down in that, and they killed all these people and they killed all these people and stuff like that. When you can go and dig into commentaries, there are so many available online at Bible Hub and places like that.
Yeah.
That you can get insight that you might have missed out. And it's not that the Bible can't teach you something just as it stands. Obviously, it can.
Right.
But when you hit those places where you're struggling, that's when it's good to dig further and try to get to the root of things, and to have people that you can talk to about what you're reading, people you can bounce ideas off of. And
Well, I think that the commentaries are very useful, and I think the place that they come into play the most is when you're really struggling to find where God is in a certain thing. Because, I mean, let's face it, we are, without a doubt, missing a bunch of the cultural understanding,
Sure.
unless you have spent hours upon hours upon hours, or even years upon years studying the culture of these people.
Right.
There's so much of it that you just don't understand because you don't know what you don't know. And so that's when you rely on these people. Yes, Scripture, in my opinion, is written for every man.
Yes.
Every person. So,
you're fine. We knew what you meant.
yeah. And so it's not meant to be overly complicated. But what makes it complicated is when there's pieces that were understood by the writers and the people who it was written for. We're missing those people, those pieces.
Yeah.
And that's, to me, when the commentaries really help, because it can say, and this is important because in that time, or you really get to draw that parallel and see into lives of people who were living then and that culture.
Just make sure you read more than one.
Just make
of
sure you read more than one.
varied type of author.
How many times? We can't say that enough.
No, it's easy to find one that you agree with and stick with that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also easy to get seriously tripped up if you come across somebody who is throwing out things that is hard to believe. Just because people have spent time with it and written about it doesn't mean they're right.
Right.
Yeah.
And that doesn't make us right on everything we come here.
No,
See,
I've gotten stuff wrong plenty of times.
Yes. And that's, I think, the beauty of this, what we do around this table is we're asking those questions because we admit that we don't know. And so we're kind of leveraging on what you've read, what the questions that I come up with, what you've read, so
Yeah.
it's important that the more informed we are, I think the better questions we have to ask. And once you start asking the right questions, that's when it really starts coming alive. And asking the questions of why is this important helps it to come alive that much more.
Sure. You really come to know the character of God. And when you
Right.
understand the character of God, you love him more. We get teased for sticking around in the Old Testament so much, but the stories are so rich. And Caleb is an incredible story of faith. I mean, on the same line as David, when David goes to face Goliath and he says, I've got this. God took care of me with the lion. He'll take care of me with this. I mean, that is Caleb as an 85-year-old man saying, I want that land where all the giants are. I'll take it. I got this. I may be 85. I don't care. And he does. And he takes maybe even a little bit more than that. I mean, the stories that come to life in the Old Testament are incredible. And if you look, you'll see Jesus in all of it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's
Without
no
a
doubt.
doubt.
Yeah.
It
So-
is unified.
You said you had some questions for us, Kyle. I guess especially because this is such a large section that we're kind of going over. So I'm curious to hear what some of your questions are. If maybe Marie and I can help you,
Maybe we can answer it.
or maybe
we
we'll be
can't.
like, nah, we got that same question.
I forgot to write them down. No, I think it's just I have the questions. Y'all were talking about Caleb. And how he's 85. I mean, you were kind of talking about Caleb a little bit there.
He's funny. He's this old guy who is, I'm going to go to battle and take this land. It doesn't matter that I'm this age. I'm perfectly fit for battle. And then you've got Ephraim and Manasseh, like one chapter later, just like you hear this whiny teenager voice. I don't want to clean my room kind of thing, except it's, I don't want to take the forest, but I need more land. And it's just like, ugh. You compare that, you put them up against Caleb, and there's just no contest. It reminds me of when my grandfather, my dad's dad, was still going to the gym when he was a little bit younger, but in his older years, and would whoop up on some of the younger guys in his older age, and it was just it reminds me of Caleb in a way. But that comparison.
And he's such an interesting figure, kind of nestled in the middle of the book of Joshua that I didn't know about. I mean, I obviously know about Caleb, but I didn't know this portion of the story that's nestled in chapter 14 and 15 about him. And because he gets lost, after he and Joshua scout out the land early
Back in Numbers.
Back in Numbers, and the two of them are the only ones that of all of these people are like, no, the land is great. We need to we need to have faith in God and go take the land.
Yeah.
And Caleb kind of fades into the background.
Which is so funny because he is the one that did all the talking when they came back. And Caleb's the one that like shushed the people and said, no, you're wrong. We can do this. And Joshua's just kind of there.
Yeah.
But we always hear Joshua and Caleb.
Right.
Because Joshua's got his own book.
Yeah.
But it was Caleb who was the outspoken one. And Joshua, like I said, is just kind of there.
And you and I talked about the difference between the two of them. And because we were kind of like, well, they seem to be around the same, likely around the same age.
Yeah.
Why did Joshua become the one who was the apprentice to Moses? And who then is Caleb in the midst of all of this? What was his role? And when we started this study of Joshua, one of the things that I said was, I really believe that Joshua's gifts and talents were for kind of such a time. He was obviously has proven himself to be a leader, a strategist, strategist, whatever, and thinks in that he was the right leader for the right time.
Yeah.
So it's almost like he's the military brains, while it seems that potentially likely Caleb is kind of the military brawn.
Yes.
Because I think they were still a team together, even though we don't get very much information of Caleb until he kind of pulls
Right.
up. But this little nugget of him on the front end when we kind of see him,
Yeah.
as a spy, and then this back end where he is saying, God has promised me this land, which I read in a few commentaries, and I don't know if you did, where there's no actual recording of this promise that Caleb.
It's not specifically
says.
Hebron, but
Yeah.
God does say, and I don't have my notes with me. It's in Numbers.
Okay.
Caleb was faithful. Caleb, your people will walk the land.
Yeah.
And so it's not as specifically, I'm going to give you cities. But yeah, I read that too.
So
that maybe there was conversation that happened that was not specifically recorded in Numbers, but
Well, he holds on to it, and he
Yeah.
faithfully kind of goes in boldly, and it's like, hey, God said this thing to me, and I believe it to be true, and so I'm going to pursue it. And he says, and nothing's going to hold me back from it, like not even my age. Don't discriminate against me because of my age. This was the promise that was given to me. I'm going to step into that promise. I'm going to take that promise, and because that's what God said.
yeah.
And there's the difference to some degree.
Numbers 14
Numbers 14.
Is the promise.
is the promise to Caleb.
What does it say?
So, but my servant Caleb, because he has had a different spirit and has followed me fully, I will bring into the land which he entered, and his descendants shall take possession of it. So maybe, the specific section of land. I mean, I can't imagine that all the spies went out and were like a team of spies. They probably all went in their own little ways and then came back and whatever. And so maybe that's the land that he entered and said, no, we got it.
Yeah.
Back in Numbers.
Right.
And so he's saying, no, I've been here before. God said I could have it.
Yeah.
This is
Yeah.
mine.
Maybe so.
Maybe so. Yeah.
I mean, it's a small leap. Doesn't really matter. But I think it helps paint the picture
It does.
a little better.
Yeah.
As to why Caleb says, I want to go here.
Yeah.
and he takes it.
Yeah.
And he takes it. And one of the things that's very interesting, I think, is that what is clear is what we've constantly said. The land is God's to give. The promise is his to fulfill and give to us. And then we have a responsibility to then take. You can't just, faith is not about just receiving. At some point, you have to walk out on faith. There is an
Right.
action
Right.
that goes along with it. So for the people, they receive the land, but they still have to take the land. They have to clear the land. They have to settle the land and build homes and whatever else. We see Caleb really boldly like saying, this is the promise that God gave me. I'm going to declare that I believe that promise and then go take
Yeah.
what I was promised.
Yeah.
And do everything I need to do to live into that promise. My faith is going to be acted out. Kind of as long as you just say, all right, go. I'm doing it. You know?
Okay, so what you're saying is that James's idea in the New Testament is an Old Testament idea of if you're going to have faith, you better act it out.
Yes.
There's our New Testament tie-in for today.
Well, the tie-in
Yes.
is always,
It's always
this was Jesus' Bible.
right. Yeah.
Yes.
And if you want to
So, I mean,
irritate a
that-
pastor,
that-
then they say, who wrote that book? You can always say Jesus.
but everything you were just saying there,
Yeah.
it rang to that
Yeah.
today, if we're gonna have faith, our faith without us actually living that faith out is just empty words.
Yeah. Yeah. And we see after the taking of the land, there's some empty words
Yeah.
too, because they don't fully clear out. Most of the territories don't fully
No.
clear out their land.
Nope.
And they will lose pieces of it, or they will be Canaanites will, or however the otherites will inhabit pieces of it that eventually become the downfall of the people of God. Because when we turn the page from Joshua to Judges, it's horrendous, and it doesn't take very long. And so there is work on our part. It's not. I had a conversation with somebody not long ago about following God is not about the work that I can do. That's not what gets me to God. That's not what holds me to God. Like he doesn't count my work. But my work, my what comes out of my faith is that work that continues to push me towards God, pull me towards God, however you want to explain it. It is that outflowing.
Yeah.
If you do not have the outflowing, there will be a separation and a distance between you and God. God doesn't have the checklist of Becky did this today and this today and this today and this today. Her works have got her in a good, she's one day closer to heaven or anything.
Another jewel in your crown.
Although I do believe that jewel's my crown. No, I don't believe that. But I have a responsibility. I can't just sit back and let it all happen to me.
Right.
That's not how this faith journey works.
Well, God invites us into active participation in what he's doing. And if you're not doing exactly what you're saying, then are we really being who God has called us to be?
Right. And there's obedience to that too that is difficult on our parts. But that obedience draws us closer. The people's disobedience lost them land. Ultimately, we lost more than half the nation of the people of God when we get to the divided nation and then the conquering of the northern kingdom and all that kind of stuff. And even today, that land, and it's just an example because it's not about the land necessarily anymore, but that land is being fought over. And our relationship with Jesus is being fought over in a lot of ways. So we have to put something in to continue to get something out as well. But the putting something in is the recognition that we get more, even more out of it. Because God's not going to stop giving.
Right.
But so the people had to have action. And when we find out what happens when they don't have action. But Caleb is a great example of someone who is action of stepping into the faith and
It's
taking
very
what he
bold.
believes of God.
And he and Joshua even have that in common, that boldness we talked about last week with the day the earth stood still or did it. And but that prayer that Joshua prayed was so bold. And you see that same type of boldness in Caleb of we've got this because God's on our side. That bold trust is such a beautiful example for everyone today. Do you really trust God as you step into this next thing, whatever it is for you? Do you really trust that if God's with you, you can take that land or whatever, so to speak? And I think for a lot of us today, we struggle with that kind of bold faith. We are pushed. There's so much pushback on that these days that, we don't step on toes and we don't call out things like sin. And we really don't talk about the Holy Spirit. There's so much pushback in the faith today of it's fine if you want to do that, but you do that over there quietly. And we are invited into a boldness. Jesus said, Great Commission, you go out and you take my name to the ends of the earth. We are still taking, it's just not land, it's souls for the cause of Jesus Christ. That is, the warfare is spiritual now. And we live in such a time that there is a pushback to be timid and quiet. And sin is not a thing anymore. Don't talk to people about that because then they won't come back. There's so much of this that we need to look at the Calebs of this world and be bold to stand back. And if people call us on it and are mad at us for it, it means we're doing it right.
Yeah. And I want to draw a parallel as well between Caleb and Rahab. When we started this book in chapter 2 when we met Rahab, and we've kind of questioned, well, how much did Rahab really know. What was her faith necessarily like in the things that she boldly proclaims about God at the time? So the difference then is maybe Rahab is in her early understanding, while Caleb, we know, has 40, 50, 60 years or longer, however long, of being in the presence and the relationship with Yahweh. Both were bold.
Right.
Both were bold to proclaim what they knew at the time to be true, and then to continue to grow in those things. And we've got one who is not an Israelite at all, and then we've got one who, well, there's debate, honestly, if Caleb was an Israelite. So they could be even more similar in that regard, is these two potential people who are not even born into the faith with blood going through their veins of generations of Israelites of the faith, who are stepping into the boldness from where they are. And I say that just because I think that one of the problems about Christianity, people who are Christ followers, is that people think I need to do X, Y, Z at this point, and I'm not there yet. And so they just don't do anything. You need to be bold at where you're at, where God and you are right then. And then as you grow, maybe your boldness grows to a different place. But we are too afraid that we need to be more. As the youth says, we got to be extra somehow.
I think extra
I learned a lot of things. I'm probably not using it correctly.
I don't think it's a good thing to be extra.
Whatever. Well, they're not being extra, so that's the problem. But we should be bold of where you are.
Yeah.
And then grow in that faith. And I come back to, because it's just such a good visual for me. I mean, mentioning John Wesley and his understanding of grace, and so there's the prevenient grace, which is the grace that goes before. There is the justifying grace. So when you're thinking about a house, so you're thinking about prevenient grace as the outside of the house.
Yeah.
Justifying grace is that moment where you decide to step through through the threshold of the house. You've been out on the porch, and you've decided to step through that beautiful moment of justifying grace where you accept Jesus. Sanctifying grace is the rest of your journey of exploring the house. Are you bold enough to go into the kitchen? Are you bold enough now to go into the bedroom? Are you bold enough now to move into the next? That's what sanctifying grace is. It's the rest of your life of pushing through the house and exploring the new pieces of the house.
Right.
And so you live into and are as bold as you are standing in the foyer. And then you're as bold as you are once you've gotten to the living room.
Yeah.
And then you're as bold as you are once you've gotten to wherever the next place of the house is in your sanctifying grace. And that's what we see in the difference of Rahab's at the threshold. She's maybe kind of on the cusp either of justifying grace or has just stepped through the door. Who knows? We don't know. But Caleb has been exploring the house. And they're bold in proclaiming who God is where they are, which is who we're supposed to be as Christ followers. So this is what we pick up from. See this beautiful thread in this book of Joshua. I didn't know was there.
Yeah,
right.
It's almost a better story if Caleb is not an Israelite in a way. Yeah, because what a call to us who are grafted in to that. But maybe he was, and that's something we'll kind of get into more later. But when we teach on Thursday, we'll get into that more. But Caleb's a fascinating character who, in my opinion, doesn't get enough screen time.
Right.
I would like to know more about Caleb.
Yep.
So my question now is, as we've kind of talked about Caleb here, we move through the rest of these several chapters. It's more than several.
Don't worry.
All the way through chapter 19, and we start seeing the tribes.
Yeah.
And all the land that is given to them, and really, I mean, it looks like when you start in chapter 15, outside of just a couple of side stories of this here and that, you're really just getting the land grants here.
You're getting the boundary lines,
and especially
and the
when you get to the smaller ones.
They move really quickly.
They move
That,
really
that is
quickly,
classic
like-
Joshua too,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
We've seen this over and over in our story where we'll be painstaking. I mean, the tribe of Judah allotment is painstaking. We
It's
know every
repeated.
inch of that
Yeah.
boundary, but by the time you get to
Naphtali.
it's like
Yeah,
yeah, and he was over
Issachar
there.
and Asher. And,
Yeah.
They were over there.
yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah. So I do find it interesting that we were talking earlier, and I couldn't remember, but we do have the lines and the tribes here that are what's the word I'm looking for? Established
Right.
now with the land of Benjamin, where Saul comes from eventually, and the land of Judah, which is where David comes from.
David
of course, we know one of Jesus's other titles is the Lion of Judah.
Yes.
And so we're seeing the building blocks of the rest of the story
Yeah.
as it comes through. And I'm curious to know, because I haven't done all of the reading, all of these smaller little lands, where are they, north, south, and the ones that kind of disappeared? Because we pretty much lost completely the northern kingdom.
Yeah, so
Right.
we lose 10 of the 12 tribes when the Assyrians come in and cart off the north. So
Right.
what's left is Benjamin and Judah.
Okay.
Is that right? Benjamin and Judah?
Simeon is inside of Judah.
Maybe
it's
so is it
Judah.
just
Maybe
kind of
it's just
absorbed? Well,
Judah.
because consider that once David is king,
I'm sure Benjamin gets
things do look
Yeah.
different. I was looking at a map, and the whole Mediterranean coast is lost to our people by that point.
Yeah.
You've got the Philistines and then Phoenicia above them, and I don't think any of that territory
ever
belongs to the
taken.
Israelites anymore.
Yeah.
And so we are not all the way down to the Wadi of Egypt
No.
at that point either. So even with David, consider that the land has shrunk.
Yes.
And then you get the division. And so the northern kingdom is called Israel and the southern kingdom is called Judah. And so in that southern kingdom, I don't know off the top of my head which tribes. At that point, Simeon's just kind of been absorbed into Judah.
Okay, so I need to go back again, but isn't
That's some maps.
Jerusalem in Benjamin?
I think so.
Probably.
on, I got
Maybe.
some.
So I do wonder if Simeon
flip to
gets
the
kind of
maps.
absorbed to some degree within
Yeah.
Judah, and so it's not necessarily that it's the 10 are lost. Maybe it's considered 9, but I thought Benjamin. I thought Jerusalem was in Benjamin. We keep that portion, or it could be in the top.
I think
of
it's
Judah.
just they're not really.
I don't have my map sitting. With
They're
me,
not really
so-
divided anymore at that point. It's just Judah and Israel, and
Yeah.
so let's see. Simeon
But
goes all the way down
Jerusalem
to
was the
whatever.
capital
So,
of
yeah.
the nation at the time. So
Right.
wherever Jerusalem finally lays, which I thought it
Jerusalem
was
is on the border between Benjamin and Judah.
So they may, one of the things about that you'll kind of notice about the boundaries is there's a little bit of flexibility too. And the reason for that, I read from one person, which I can get behind, is there are some areas of the land that are very clear. It's a really clear boundary. And then there's some when you read it that it's like Jerusalem kind of gets shared by these two, or this one gets shared by these two. The idea of that
Right.
was that God has started with 12 tribes that he's going to make one nation.
Right.
So there's a flexibility to the boundaries because God doesn't want you to get too stuck on what your area is and me too stuck on what my area is, because we are one nation.
Yeah.
So we still share. And whatever resources you have in your tribal area, I may need some of. So that's why there's some kind of sharing, overlapping flexibility, because this was 12 tribes that was going to become one full nation, one complete at some point. And they needed to see themselves as that. So we've got Naphtali and Ishkar or whatever. We've got we're going to talk about
Asher,
Dan in just a
Zebulun.
second. Asher, Ishkar, Zebulun. Those are all in the northern part.
Yeah.
Anyway.
It would appear, in looking at my maps, kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Judah's just Judah.
Yeah.
all the other, and Simeon has just been absorbed into that.
Yeah.
All the other
with Judah.
land is the land of Israel.
Yeah.
And even at this point, at the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, at the point of this map, we've lost a good chunk of the northern anyway.
Yeah. And remember, the east side, too, that
Yes.
gets lost in it as well. And I don't know if something necessarily, we'd have to continue reading, obviously, of Scripture to see what has
Part of it's
transpires
still
with
there
them,
as
but-
Israel,
Yeah.
but definitely a chunk of it in the northern part has been lost to somebody. Is Syria, I guess.
It is Assyria. The Babylonians take
So-
the rest of us off later on.
All of the Mediterranean. Now, this map shows that Israel has the Mediterranean coastline, Mediterranean Sea.
When God maps out the land, he gives them all the pieces of the full land, but he says, like in early chapter 13, there's still some places that have to be taken, and I'll take care of those. But the problem is that while God is faithful to continue to conquer what needs to be conquered, the people are not. So they
Yeah.
never take they don't go all the way down to the Wadi of Egypt. They don't go all the
No.
way up to the mountains of Lebanon.
Nope.
They don't take all of that coastline that's supposed to be and was given when the boundaries were
Yeah.
drawn, but they never conquer all of it.
Right.
And we know that coastline Gaza Strip
Yeah.
is still a fight. That was
Yep.
where the Philistines, right? And it's today still a fight about who owns that land.
Yeah. So you're going to see these boundaries as we go through Joshua. And that was the ideal. Yes, you can have all of that. You have to go take it.
Yes.
And so what they actually settle versus what is promised is not the same.
It's not the same. It's not all of it. Yeah. So the northern kingdom gets taken away, and it's all of these.
It's all of the tribes except for Judah. And I guess at that point, Simeon's just absorbed into
yeah.
Judah.
Yeah.
And I guess because Benjamin kind of sits on that corner.
Benjamin,
so it's
Kinda
kind
in the
of
middle there.
Benjamin
It's-
was north of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was
Yeah.
at the southern border. So
Yeah. So there you
Benjamin
go.
is part of the northern kingdom, Israel, according to this map.
all gone,
All gone.
never to be heard of again. Which is
It's kind of sad. I mean, all the work that God did preparing the land for them, and basically the people just kind of squandered it.
not very many generations after they take it.
Yeah.
No.
I don't know how many.
They're not there very
kind
long.
of generations Judges lasts, because I haven't
know.
really spent a lot of time in.
I don't know if
Judges.
anybody knows because we've assumed there's more judges than just the ones that are talked about.
But the sad fact is,
Some of them are
that-
going on at the same time.
Yeah. The sad fact is when you think about when they become one full nation under Saul, even though he doesn't completely unite them all, then we have David who does this beautiful unite, and they were working on taking the rest of the land under David.
Yeah.
Then Solomon, and Solomon continues that campaign to take the land, and he builds the temple, and he really settles Jerusalem to be this majestic and very fortified capital. But Solomon did some things wrong too. And after that, the land splits, and within, I think, 2 generations after that, I have to go back, we've lost the northern kingdom completely.
Yeah.
It's a
That's
huge
not
piece
that
of land.
long.
Yeah.
That they,
In the grand scheme of
in the
things.
grand scheme of things, yes, especially in the grand scheme of the story of the people of God, it's not that long at all before they lose what they have gotten here.
Just another reminder, it's not their stuff. It's not
Yeah.
our stuff. And
Right.
and we look at how brutal those battles were, but the land isn't the Canaanites, it's God's. And they were behaving in very sinful ways, and God runs them out. I think Leviticus says the land vomited them
Yeah.
out.
Yeah.
Well, Israelites didn't do what they were supposed to do, and it's not their land either. I mean, so they get run off from it.
Yeah.
So, Becky, do you have, I know you've got more notes. I don't know if you have things left to address today or if we pretty much dealt with it all.
I mean, there's
think
so
we've-
much more, but-
Yeah, there's so much. We're never going to cover all of it. Honestly, we're never going to cover all of it in one podcast or even one lesson tomorrow.
You could
when we
come
do
at this book from so many angles.
Yeah.
I understand that now.
Yeah, I do too. And I guess the only other thing that I would say is I mentioned Dan really briefly that I think we should kind of talk about for just a second, and maybe we'll talk about it a little bit tomorrow.
Yeah.
But Dan is a very interesting. It's the last one mentioned, and it's interesting because they never actually take their land.
Okay.
They lose it so quickly, and then they kind of take other land and name it Dan. It's like, you didn't see that, God.
Yeah.
You didn't see where we like messed it up over there,
Right.
and we fixed it. When Scripture tells us that, and this would lend itself also to the idea of the author being in captivity, because really where they lose the land is mentioned in Judges.
Yeah.
Judges, it's like a middle chapter, 14, 15, 16, something like that, where it tells the story of how the tribe of Dan loses their land and then has to go conquer a kind of another area, and they name it Dan.
Okay.
You know, like a sleight of hand.
Right.
Like, nobody notices you screwed up.
Yeah.
And so it would mean then that the author is using Judges coming back to Joshua to kind of make a statement of the allotment of land. Everybody knew it, you know, already, because how else would you know that Dan messed up
Right.
Yeah.
bad, you know? And a lot of the other ones will kind of say a little bit of, even in theirs, of like, well, there's this boundary there was somebody who they didn't conquer or whatever. This one still has some people or whatever. But Dan is the only one that messes up to this extent, that they are kind of listed, and they're the last set beyond the inheritance of Joshua, which ends out our section. But they're look, I read it. Judges 18 is where it's written the story of how Dan loses their stuff, and then just renames something else. So they're just unique in a different way.
Okay.
That I think we should take a minute to talk about, because they are the exception in a very, very different way.
Gotcha.
Would you like to know what my Bible says about where
Yeah.
they ended up?
Yeah.
I'm looking at Judges. So they, of course, pretty much every chapter of Judges opens with, in those days, Israel had no king. And so they're seeking a place of their own where they might settle, because they had not yet come into the inheritance. Here we are in Judges 18, and they still haven't gone and done what they're supposed to do.
So
But
here's the thing, just to stop you for just
Yeah.
a second. The tribe of Dan, when you look at the map, is on the border of the water of the Mediterranean,
Yes.
right above the land of the Philistines. And
Yeah.
I think they probably took a portion of the Philistine land, which we know from the book of Joshua has not been conquered yet. My assumption then is they never took it because they were frightened of the Philistines.
yeah, well, they didn't trust God.
And you had to really hold that land because it's a port.
yeah.
And they
Yeah.
didn't trust God to do it. Okay,
Yeah.
continue on.
So they came to Laish, Laish.
Yeah.
Modern Tel Dan.
We've been there.
What happened in Tel Dan? It's way north.
It is way north.
That is where the false altar got built.
Yeah.
That started the Northern Kingdom and their whole crash and burn.
Are we sure that it's the
That's
same
what this
Tel Dan,
says.
though? I mean, but
A
here's
city
the
at the
thing.
foot
that,
of okay, if that's fair. A city at the foot of Mount Hermon.
because there may have been another Tel Dan.
That's a good point.
I
All
thought,
right, all right.
I thought there was another Tel
okay.
Dan in the south.
Okay, this is where's Mount Hermon?
We went to the north one though.
No,
We went to
Mount
the north
Hermon is in the.
Hang on.
Hermon is in the north. I really need to
Mount Hermon's in the north.
spend a lot of time looking at a map.
Oh, how interesting would that be if that all lines up? Because that's where the false altar got built that started them down
Yep.
the whole path of Assyria coming in and carting them off forever. And
Which
then we
king was
notice
It was under.
Probably started with a
It
J.
was Jeroboam. It was Rehoboam and Jeroboam, and it was right when the kingdom split after Solomon. So Jeroboam is in the north. Rehoboam has Jerusalem. Jeroboam says, "Oh, you guys don't all have to go to Jerusalem to worship. We'll just build a little altar up here in the north, and you can just come up here. We're just going to keep it simple." And God is like, "Whoa,
Yeah.
I didn't give you permission. You are still, even though I've given you permission to divide, I never gave you permission to create
Right.
another place of worship.
he didn't, and he didn't just build
The
an
temple
altar.
is still it.
Yeah.
He built an idol.
That's right.
and he says, "This will be our representation of God." I mean,
Incorporated
it was so bad.
Incorporate those
There's
Dananites.
Well, and what tribe isn't listed in Revelation?
yes, that's what we talked about yesterday. Dan is not listed in Revelation as one of the tribes.
Man, they were so disobedient.
And didn't Doug say yesterday there is an assumption or a belief that the Antichrist comes out of Dan? And I don't really know. This is why I don't study Revelation, because I'm like, oh my gosh, conversation of an Antichrist. I don't even know. I'm not ready to wrap my brain around that. But
so you got to put a tinfoil hat on for that one.
I don't know.
Fresh out of foil.
But according to Revelation, Dan is not mentioned at all as a tribe.
Yes, that was. Oh, that's right. Okay, it was Irenaeus, a writer, an old, long ago writer that makes that suggestion.
Okay.
About the Antichrist coming out of Dan. Which, I mean, apparently at this point, you can't find a more disobedient tribe.
Yeah.
They didn't take their land. They went up north and they founded the city that just ended it all for the northern kingdom.
That is true, because after that, it's not long after that they get all decimated in the north. But Jeroboam starts it. Well, I guess Dan starts it, and Jeroboam until Dan.
So they were supposed to take a whole swath of land and they wound up settling for one city up
super
north.
far away.
Yeah.
That's really far away
Yeah.
from their land is down here over by Judah and the Philistines, and they're at the tip.
Yeah, because
Oh, I want to
the
dig
high
into this
point.
further and make sure that I've got that straight. This might be
in
way
the
off
coming
base.
episode, Going Deeper, we talk about Dan in further detail.
See, it's even more interesting.
Oh,
Love
man,
the
if that,
Bible.
Oh, if all that lines up, how
Love the Bible.
fascinating.
So fascinating.
So where are we
Okay,
headed
We're done.
next week?
I don't even know anymore.
We are
I'm on deck for next week.
Yeah, that's
right.
And
That's
we are-
right. Yeah.
We're going to talk a little bit more about
Yeah.
land distribution, but it's the distribution of the Levites need to get their cities.
Right.
And Levites are not, they're not the tribe that gets a boundary. The Levites will get pieces in each tribe.
Right.
Because they need to be in each tribe to help continue to
Yeah.
tell the story, to be the voice of God in that space.
And who are the Levites? They are the priests.
They are the
correct?
priests,
Yes.
right. So we will talk about the Levites' land. We will talk about the cities of refuge. We will talk about the man slayer.
Is that
the
next
blood
week?
something or other? I think so.
I think you're
I'm
right.
pretty sure. So
Yeah, that's right.
We're
We're
going to talk
almost done.
about the manslayer and the blood. What's it called? I can't remember right now.
Don't
Anyway,
know.
so those are what we're going to talk about next week. So it's
Because we'll be pulling from other books for
Yeah.
some of that.
And
Yeah.
we've really only got how
Avenger
many?
of Blood.
after
how many
this
episodes?
one. There's 3 more.
3 more. So we are quickly approaching the end of season 1 of Going Deeper. And I can't wait for next week and the weeks to come, because really once you get to the end of the book of Joshua, there's some really fascinating stuff happening. So I'm excited for y'all out there who are listening and watching. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe. iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, Google Podcasts, they're changing the name of it. I don't know what it is. Podbean, all those places, and on YouTube. And I guess that's it for this week.
Yeah.
We will see y'all next time.